Shemai, what's happening? Welsh Soul Crew, welcome back to Wales in the Movies. I've got a real bad hangover, which is appropriate because today we're looking at the career of Dylan Thomas, and more appropriately, the history of Dylan Thomas in the movies. Despite worldwide fame lasting until now in the 21st century, there's not a huge body of poetic work for fans or newbies to get their teeth into. But his reputation survives to this day. It's hard to think of another poet worldwide who has the reputation, the profile, and the infamy to match Big Dylan. His life and work seem connected to the world of cinema and celluloid in some way. Along with his belligerent and boozy behaviour, it is perhaps the regular representations of and references to him which keep on extending his legacy more than 65 years after he boozed himself to death. Personally, my first exposure to Dylan Thomas was the reference to him in the 1997 film Twin Town, and this famous moment here.
It's a play on words. What? Dylan Thomas. Huh? The poet, Dylan Thomas. He said Swansea is the graveyard of ambition. And he was right.
During his working life, of course, he was not just a poet. He also found himself doing reading tours, writing scripts, and performing voiceovers, mainly for British wartime propaganda films and often for the Ministry of Information. I'll level with you, I'm not exactly what you would call a fan or an appreciator or particularly knowledgeable about music or poetic art forms, which is why I tend to really keep my mouth shut and never extend my opinions to anything more nuanced than like or don't like. It's also true that there are plenty of folk within the Welsh national movement, shall we say, who seem to be getting a little bit frustrated with the artistic establishment's fetishization of the work of Dylan Thomas. He's kind of like the artistic and Iron Bevan. We always seem to turn to him in times of cultural need. And I can get this frustration, particularly when there are other poets who aren't as celebrated as Dylan, particularly poets whose most famous quotations don't actually insult Wales, which Dylan seemed a little bit prone to doing. But I also get why he's celebrated so much, because Dylan Thomas is quite a rare person from a Welsh point of view, because what he is a very identifiable and marketable Welsh thing. So today we're going to look at the entire history of Dylan Thomas in the movies. Now, rather than working on a linear chronological timeline, what I'm going to do is go through the different categories of representation and art forms, and what we're going to look at first are the movie scripts penned by Big Dylan. All in all, Dylan wrote 23 film scripts. Many of these were short documentaries, and even more of them were never made, which is standard practice. Most of these were produced by a company called Strand Films, and it was wartime propaganda. The titles include 358 Balloon Sight, Wales, Green Mountain, Black Mountain, Conquest of a Germ, and Our Country. And there's a very reasonably priced Dylan Thomas wartime anthology on DVD, which you can get on Amazon, and I'll put a link down to that in the descriptions. Away from wartime propaganda, Thomas wrote 3 scripts that were turned into fiction movies. Pretty impressive, hey? First of all, you've got 3 Weird Sisters, released in 1948. Also, he wrote a film called No Room at the Inn, which was adapted from a stage play. And most interestingly, in the same year, 1948, Dylan Thomas wrote the script for what would eventually become the movie Rebecca's Daughters more than 40 years later in 1992, when it was directed by the acclaimed Welsh filmmaker and documentarian Carl Francis. Now, this film is not commercially available, despite starring Peter O'Toole and Jodie Richardson. And it's also a pretty fascinating bit of radical Welsh history. If you're not aware of the story of the Rebecca riots, I'll put a link to a fascinating and introductory podcast by the lads over at Desolation Radio, who do a really good job of introducing newbies, like I was at the time, to the story and its context. So please check that out. But yeah, Rebecca's Daughters, starring a bona fide international movie star, directed by an acclaimed filmmaker, about a fascinating moment in Welsh history, written by perhaps the world's most famous ever Welshman, Dylan Thomas. It's not available anywhere to buy. WTF. Dylan not only contributed to the lore and the history of movies as a creator, but also, interestingly, as a subject. First of all, you've got the documentary, Dylan Thomas, which won the documentary Oscar in 1963, directed by Jack Howell and starring and narrated by Richard Burton, who is a bit of a boozy partner of Dylan's. Again, this is very hard, perhaps even impossible to get hold of. I've still never seen a copy. Wales, sort it out. There have also been 2 TV films made by the BBC focused on the same point in time, which is Dylan's US tour in the last few days before he drank himself to death. The first one is Dylan, Life and Death of a Poet in 1978, and the second one, more recently, was A Poet in New York, starring the English actor Tom Hollander.
Dylan, please.
Also available on DVD is something called Return Journey, which is a bit of a unique piece of work, directed by, interestingly, Anthony Hopkins, and starring Bob Kingdom as Dylan. It's interesting for a few minutes, but it does get very boring. It's basically just Kingdom standing behind a lectern, reading out Dylan Thomas essays and work. Next off, we're looking at commercial feature films, where each time Dylan Thomas has been played by a Welsh actor. Well, hey! First of all, we've got The Edge of Love in 2008. This was written by Sharma MacDonald, whose daughter, Keira Knightley, plays Vera Phillips, Dylan's former love interest. I think she does a pretty good job, and this looks like it should be a terrific film. The biggest problem is that in it, Dylan is a supporting character. Now, if it had been a cameo or a main character, that could work, but to have such a notorious, legendary and strong personality coupled with Matthew Rhys putting in a sinister performance, you could say, as Dylan, despite it working fantastically as an isolated performance, it's just so distracting from the rest of the film that it makes it just an absolute mess.
I get them all to do that, then I don't have to sell my soul writing bloody propaganda films. I can write my bloody poetry.
Secondly, you've got Set Fire to the Stars from 2014. This was conceived and written by Ynys finest, Celyn Jones, who also gives a irritable and rotund performance as Dylan on the final slide before he eventually dies in New York. It's also starring Elijah Wood, which makes it quite a marketable piece of work. And it's produced by Film Cymru Wales, who are effectively the Welsh Film Council. And I think this is probably the high point in terms of fictional representations of Dylan in the movies. And it's directed by Andy Goddard, who I think previously directed Doctor Who and Torchwood. I think this one's well worth checking out.
Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion.
And also, you've got the film Dominion, which I think is in 2015. Now, this is a familiar tale I'm about to tell you. Dominion stars Rhys Ifans and John Malkovich, which you would think would raise its profile somewhat. But just like Dylan Thomas, the documentary, just like Rebecca's Daughters, I can't find a copy of Dominion anywhere. You can see the trailer on YouTube, and it's also set in the last few days of Dylan's life in New York. But honestly, I can't give you an opinion about this one because I still haven't managed to get a copy of it. Wales. Now, last but not least in that area, we also have Dylan Thomas, the film Extra. This genuine bit of Welsh history was discovered by a man called Jeff Towns, who is known as the Dylan Thomas guy on Twitter. And it is Dylan Thomas as an extra in the background, specifically for the film Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, which had these scenes filmed on Pendine Beach. And what I find so notable about this is that for such an infamous, legendary, famous person who was the center of attention wherever he went, this is still the only video or film footage existing of Dylan Thomas that exists in the world. Remarkable. Now, next category is film adaptations of Dylan's work, and of course the most popular work to be adapted was Under Milk Wood. The 1972 film starring Richard Burton was directed by Andrew Sinclair. In 2014, Kevin Allen for Film Cymru made dual English and Welsh language versions with an absolutely belting Welsh cast. Now, I think this is a fantastic piece of work in either languages, visually rich, really naughty and sexy, definitely worth checking out. The same year, the BBC also made a TV adaptation of Under Milk Wood, which again, I think is inventive and pretty watchable, and again, with an absolute belting Welsh cast. Other than that, you've got the 1987 BBC TV film, A Child's Christmas in Wales, which was starring Denham Elliott. It's not a coincidence for a poet whose work has often been described as painting with words that he's had those words used as a reference in so many Hollywood movies, most notably for purposes of pathos. So finally, let's look at all the references to Dylan Thomas in the world of films. In the 1980 comedy Back to School, Rodney Dangerfield performs a rendition of Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. In the 1994 film Before Sunrise, Ethan Hawke reads out the W.H. Auden poem in the voice of Dylan Thomas, which is a bit confusing, but there we go.
I have this recording of Dylan Thomas reading a W.H. Auden poem. He's got a great voice. It's like all the clocks in the city began to whir and chime. Oh, let not time deceive you. You cannot conquer time.
An Ethan Hawke connection is in the film which he directed called Chelsea Walls. One of Dylan Thomas's poem appears on the wall somewhere, which is a bit of an odd one. Now, we mustn't forget the 1995 Jerry Bruckheimer movie Dangerous Minds, starring Michelle Pfeiffer. Now, this is probably the most famous reference, overt reference to Dylan in the movies. It's when an English teacher, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, sets her students the task of finding any Dylan Thomas poem to compare to the Bob Dylan song, Let Me Die in My Footsteps. And there's a moment in the film where Dylan Thomas and Bob Dylan get confused with each other, and she explains to her colleague that,
well, the guy's Welsh, there ain't a lot to do there.
I thought he was from Minnesota.
If the guy's your favorite poet, you might want to read up on him a little bit. He was Welsh and he drank himself to death.
Dead? He's not dead. I saw him yesterday on MTV.
You saw Dylan Thomas on MTV.
Bob Dylan!
and of course, Bob Dylan was originally called Bob Zimmerman and took his name from Big Dylan Marlowe Thomas. Isn't that cool? The film Independence Day in 1996 clearly references Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night with this ultra moment of cheese here from Bill Pullman.
We will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight.
The 2002 movie Solaris.
And death shall have no dominion. Dead men naked, they shall be one, with the man in the wind and the west moon, when their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone.
Now, this next one is not something that's ever been confirmed, but I find it irresistible. In the 2010 mind-bending sci-fi film Inception, which you either love or you hate, I can't help but feel that Chris Nolan is covertly referencing the Dylan Thomas poem, Our Eunuch Dreams. If you look at some of the character names, some of the themes and motifs that keep on cropping up in this film, it's a reference which is very, very hard to ignore. Also, the Welsh film historian David Berry referenced this poem when producing a documentary series for ITV in the 1980s, which was about Welsh cinema, and it was called The Dream That Kicks. The Christopher Nolan connection now is that in the film Interstellar, the character played by Michael Caine reads out the poem.
Though wise men at their end, no dark is right. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night.
So it's kind of hard not to suspect that Chris Nolan is a big fan of the words of Dylan Thomas and used them as inspiration for some of his script writing. So there you have it. There's an entire history of Dylan Thomas as represented back to us in the world of movies. Despite dying as a relatively young man, it seems that the legacy of Dylan Thomas will stay with us and the world as long as there's pens and paper to write with and cameras to capture our eunuch dreams, all seedless in the light. Ta-da.
This is the world, the lying likeness of our strips of stuff that tatter as we move, loving and being loved. The dream that kicks the buried from their sack and lets their trash be honored as the quick. This is the world. Have faith. For we shall be a shouter like the cock, blowing the old dead back. Our shots shall smack the image from the plates, and we shall be fit fellows for a life. And who remain shall flowers they love, praise to our faring hearts.